Hey, welcome, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you are watching us on our YouTube channel, I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by the venerable Pastor Josh, our faithful host. Nice to see you again.
Thank you.
and this week we are joined by Guthrie Graves-Fitzsimmons. He's a fellow for religion and faith at American Progress. Now, his work focuses on a wide range of issues related to the role of religion in American public life, including promoting a progressive vision of religious liberty that champions LGBTQ rights and amplifying how faith communities empower social and economic justice. Prior to joining the American Progress, he worked with a lot of national faith leaders on high-profile advocacy campaigns such as opposing the Muslim ban and passing comprehensive immigration reform. He has served as the Associate Director of the Rights and Inclusion Collaborative at ReThink Media, where he worked to promote Muslim, Arab, Sikh, and South Asian rights. And he previously was a faith coordinator at the National Immigration Forum, where he helped start the Evangelical Immigration Table. So thank you, Guthrie, for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and before we hit record, we were marveling over your Apple attire on your ear, and you're invoking the spirit of Steve Jobs.
When they had the pink ones come out, I was like, I have to get those bright pink.
Now is it pink or is it? It's not like original pink. It's like Apple calls it something different, right?
I think they call it coral, but I think it's pink. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah. Well. Like I said, we're really glad to have you here. We last week we spoke with Brian Kaler, which really kind of blew our minds, at least my mind anyway, is just to kind of unpack sort of this separation in church of state, Christian nationalism. We're going to have sort of a conservative from a conservative religious think tank come join us next week. So this week we really want to kind of just pick your brain and kind of figure out, like what you think about, kind of the current events, the times, religion, so on and so forth. So I'm just gonna ask you, like, with kind of this rise of Christian nationalism, like what does that term mean for you?
Well, first, let me say I'm glad you had Brian on. Brian is one of the experts I turn to when I'm thinking about the separation of church and state and the threat of Christian nationalism, because I do think it's a threat to our democracy. And Brian's been great. I've became a Baptist actually about 5 years ago. I grew up Methodist my whole life. And then when my now husband and I moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where we live now, I became a Baptist, and I've just loved being a Baptist. I loved the Baptist commitment to the separation of church and state that Brian embodies. And the Baptist Joint Committee on Religious Liberty is one of my absolute favorite organizations in DC that is really upholding, from a Christian Baptist perspective, the separation of church and state. And I find that so powerful because on the far right and the Christian nationalist right, they want to own the kind of Christian voice in democracy. As the Christian nationalists, the idea that you need to be Christian to be American, that the United States is a Christian nation. Now, of course, the United States is a majority Christian nation, but that's a very different statement than saying it's a Christian nation, which would mean that there's something about the essence of the nation that is Christian. And what I love about what Brian and what the Baptist Joint Committee is doing, and what I try to do in my own work, is to say we're Christians against Christian nationalism, that we want to be good, trying our best to be good followers of Jesus. And in our current context, that means affirming religious pluralism, that you can be any faith in this country or no faith, and that religion should not dictate public policy. Now, of course, there's a place for all of us to express our beliefs and our views, but we do it in a pluralistic way where everybody is respected. And so to know that Christians are doing that, that's what I love to be a part of. is that religious voice for religious pluralism that I believe is the antidote to Christian nationalism.
Well, that's really, really good, Guthrie. And, 13 days ago, right, 13 days ago, we celebrated the 1-year anniversary of the insurrection, or the storming of the Capitol, or maybe some people would consider it, like...
a tourist visit?
Yeah, their tourist visit, or they're doing what they thought, this country needed. Kind of like when people used to call the Civil War the War of Northern Aggression. We have this idea, So one of my questions, right? So we look at this and we see Trump flags flying right next to Jesus flags. I sent my friend, who's a super conservative. I mean, I'm really conservative, but he's a super conservative guy. I sent him a picture with Jesus wearing a MAGA hat. Like it was like one of those pictures there, and I just said, "Won't he do it?" Like that's one of our phrases we say, "Won't he do it?" And it was, of course, tongue in cheek and filled with sarcasm, and we laughed about it. But you had the QAnon shaman praying on the floor, saying his prayer for the Senate chamber. My question for you, as you saw this, what was your reaction to that time? As a Christian, as a progressive Christian, that I'm assuming would consider yourself from the left, what was your reaction to that, and how do you think we got here to that moment in our country?
Well, I will say I was actually sitting right here I was in a very long meeting that day, and my husband was texting me like they're storming the Capitol and they're in the Capitol. My brain couldn't process it. My brain couldn't process that I've been a part of many protests, many civil disobedience kind of actions, and my brain couldn't process the idea that there wouldn't have been just an excessive use of force to stop the people. Had they been a different group of people, I think there would have been an excessive use of force by law enforcement to stop them from. So at first it was shock, and then I will say dismay at the Christian symbols that we saw, and frustration, I think, because I think something I say over and over again is kind of far right Christianity, people that you brought up the Civil War, people that defended slavery out of their Christian beliefs. This kind of far right Christianity is never a surprise to me. And what I get frustrated about, and kind of my calling in life, is to uplift the good, or as what I see it, is the alternative Christian witness. And so our team at the Center for American Progress put out a report actually in February called the Pro-Democracy Faith Movement. And that was all about the faith leaders who were fighting for voting rights, fighting to defend democracy, fighting to protect the election. And so those are the voices I think that are often go unheard, whereas we're so quick. I put out my first book in 2020 called Just Faith, Reclaiming Progressive Christianity. And I went on and on, probably too much, about Westboro Baptist Church. Because Westboro Baptist Church, the people that picket the just really, really terribly anti-LGBTQ group that pickets service members' funerals, really, really fringe, terrible group. Even people that are, conservative and have conservative beliefs, I hope, could condemn what Westboro Baptist Church does. And yet that gets so much attention, that Westboro Baptist view, even though that church is tiny. So that's sort of the course of my feelings about January 6th. That I do think that those people that were saying, like, Jesus calls them to armed revolt to go kill Mike Pence or whatever they were trying to do, is a pretty fringe element in the church. And there's a much broader pro-democracy faith movement that gets far less attention.
Yeah, and so when I spoke with Brian last week, he said something that I think will stick with me for a while. We were framing, or maybe I should say I was framing, a lot of the conversation kind of in the context of, the Christian right is pushing all these initiatives or trying to Christianize America, and we started also talking about the Christian left, and I had, that the conversation evolved to, the Christian right and the Christian left really shouldn't be interfering, because it's like, Christian right wants us to, do X, Y, and Z because it's in the Bible, and then the Christian left says no, we really should be doing, A, B, and C because it's in the Bible, and it's like each side is sort of like using biblical scripture to push for an agenda that is politically advantageous for each side, and I'm curious if I mean, like I identify more with the Christian left if I had to just be honest about it, but I'm curious if, like, what are some things that the Christian left and the Christian right can use our shared appreciation of the Christian faith, to find common ground on an issue that affects all of Americans, whether you're faithful or not.
I do think there is a kind of extremist view of keeping faith out of the public square that I even recoil at sometimes, because we just celebrated Martin Luther King, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday and federal holiday this week. And I think there is a role for people bringing in their faith to the public square around specific issues, around specific causes, that makes room for people of other faiths, and doesn't say that because we're Christian and Christians are the majority in this country, Christianity should dictate public policy. And yet there is a role to say, out of my Christian faith, I don't think we should be locking kids up in cages at the border. And there's a role to do that. It's difficult sometimes, and sometimes we might disagree about where that line is. But I don't think we need to go the direction of saying religious leaders should stay out of voicing moral concerns in a pluralistic, inclusive kind of way. And when you talk about the Christian left, Christian right, there are Christian socialists, there's Christian people on the far right, there's a lot of Christian moderates who maybe are socially liberal and fiscally more conservative and want lower taxes, but they also don't want to criminalize abortion. I mean, there's people of all across the political spectrum on every different issue. I think there are Christians, and there are people that maybe don't think about certain issues because of their faith, and then say other issues are not part of their faith. So it's a very complicated and kind of situation. But what I try to do is uplift the existence of people across. I think so much of people's frustration with Christianity and politics is that we only talk about Christianity on the right. And I think it would be a lot more normalized if we just acknowledge, I don't act like the Christian right doesn't exist, whereas people on the Christian right act like the Christian left doesn't exist. And then you have Christian moderates who are frustrated by all of it. So, to go back to your question, is there common ground? And I actually got my start, as you said at the beginning of the program, doing immigration reform work. And I think that's one issue where there's a broad consensus. I worked with very, very conservative groups, the Southern Baptist Convention, the Focus on the Family. These are not liberal Christians in any sense of the word. There was a broad consensus that there could be some compromise. And actually, I was very proud to be part of this effort that got 68 votes in the United States Senate. Broadly bipartisan framework for immigration reform that included things that not everybody got everything they wanted, right? There was a pathway to citizenship for the undocumented, but there was also increased funding for kind of security measures at our borders. So it was something that people came together around, in a lot of different diverse religious communities were supportive of. So immigration, I think, is an area where there is a lot of common ground for people that would consider themselves staunchly conservative, but not in the kind of racist, Trump, nativist kind of sense. But they're conservative when it comes to lower taxes and kind of not changing the country from traditional, more whatever that in that kind of conservative sense.
Yeah. Now your husband's a pastor, right?
He
Um,
is, yes.
I'm curious, and maybe this might be an experiment I'll do one day. Is I'm curious if more like I'm curious on the version of the Bible Christian progressives read versus the version of the Bible those on the right read. Like, I mean, I tend to read like the Message Bible, sometimes the ESV, and I'm curious on what version of the Bible you and your husband read.
I love the Message. I love the NRSV, the Common English Bible. I mean, I think it's less about, I mean, some of it's about translation, but a lot of it is about your point of emphasis in Scripture. Because nobody reads the Bible completely literally, where the Bible is inconsistent in, in just, there's not, one easily digestible instruction manual in the Bible that we can take and apply to our lives. So it's, where is the emphasis? Is the emphasis on condemnation? Is the emphasis on kind of maintaining right beliefs and right practices, and then doing that by excommunicating and getting rid of the problems, and to try to purify the church and keep it pure? Is that your emphasis, or is your emphasis on Jesus's constant call to include and bring more people in, and not to judge, and to love your neighbor like you would love yourself, and to love your enemy, and to be a peacemaker? So I find, when if you ask somebody to say what are the top messages of Jesus, that will track within their kind of emphasis kind of politically and socially in our country. But I also think people do read the Bible honestly and in good faith, and come to different conclusions. So I think we'd go back to what I was saying about kind of seeing people falling differently. We'd go a long ways if I said, if we could just acknowledge there's a way to read the Bible that says same-sex marriage is holy and right before God, and there's a way to read the Bible that says, God wants us to condemn and, do conversion therapy and all of that, and just kind of have that dialogue, but honor that people are coming from a genuine place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I love that, and I completely agree with you. I was challenged a lot in my views of same-sex marriage and everything, although I very much still hold to conservative views. My brother-in-law is, he got married to his husband a few years ago, and obviously, I love them, and they're part of our family, and, fully accept them, and wouldn't want it to be otherwise. And so it's been a challenging thing. And when you talk about that, that's been one of the clarion calls of the Christian right, that something like same-sex marriage, where they are people are being sued, or they're being required to serve or whatever against their religious beliefs, and it becomes this free exercise issue in the Constitution and everything. And I think that's been covered a lot. I'm curious to ask you, what concerns you about the people on the religious left and their attitudes towards maybe people on the religious right, or people or what concerns you specifically about religious freedom? What kind of attitudes concern you, and for lack of a better term, in your own tribe or your own camp? I'm just curious to hear that, because I know the things that concern me and mine, the kind of hatred that comes out, and the homophobia that comes out, and the xenophobia that comes out, and all the stuff that can be really a terrible witness, certainly to the love of Christ, as you alluded to. But I'm curious, what are your concerns as you swim in these waters?
I guess I would say, picking any issue to be a purist ideologically about is something I just don't think that works, because I get the impulse to say these people, whatever issue, and people do it for different issues. I don't want to, single out anyone in particular. I see it in different areas, but to say you're with me on this issue or you're my political enemy, I don't think is helpful. For instance, I am married to a man. He's a pastor. I went to seminary. And at the same time, take someone like Pope Francis. Pope Francis and I agree about a lot. Not the holiness of same-sex marriage, for instance, but we agree about war and ending war and refugees and critiquing capitalism. And there's so many different areas that we agree upon that I can find common ground. So I would say any sort of labeling one group of people the enemy and the other the ideologically pure is not helpful. And instead, we should recognize diversity and look for those areas where we can kind of make progress. And peace is one that there's so many issues that don't get talked about that if you just start talking to somebody about different kinds of issues politically, you're probably going to find some place that you can find some common ground, while also realizing the goal is not to just talk about those areas we have common ground either. I don't want to, I'm happy having those debates about, I was very supportive of ending the Afghanistan war, for instance. And, 20 years, most of my life, we've been at war as a country. Now, that's a very divisive issue. Critiquing capitalism is a very divisive issue. And I've been around divisive issues my entire life. My parents are both spent their careers as labor union organizers, a kind of inherently conflictual way of life. But I believe they were uplifting worker dignity and worker rights and giving workers a voice. But that's in tension with the, owners of the businesses and everything. So I think there's a way to both say we have differences and believe, we're both principled in our advocacy across our differences, while also looking for ways we have in common.
I think that's really awesome. It's one of the reasons why Josh and I started this podcast. I mean, Josh and I rarely see eye to eye on a lot of political issues, whether it's, abortion, LGBTQ, taking down Confederate statues, because Josh used to be a Confederate. Just kidding. But we thought it was important that we at least model the behavior that we want to see in the world, at least on our podcast. I mean, we can disagree on stuff. I don't think I'm going to change his mind. He knows he's not going to change my mind. And I was just happy that he didn't vote for Trump in the last election, so I call that a win for me, but I'm curious on a couple things. One, have you read the book, Jesus and John Wayne? By Kristen Dumais.
I've read parts of it. I've not read it completely, but I do have it and have read parts of it.
It's an amazing book. Highly recommended. We had her on the show and chatted with her about it. I mean, she's just an amazing person in the first place. But part of her book, or I should say all of her book, focused on sort of this spotlight on toxic masculinity in church politics. And it's funny, as I was drafting this question to ask you, I got this email from, I forgot what organization, but it's this conference for men of God or something like that, iron sharpens iron, so on and so forth. And I would love to kind of get your thoughts on the impact of toxic masculinity in the church, if you think it's an issue, and if it is an issue, how has it affected, the church ministry, what have you?
Definitely. And I should say part of my background, just growing up, is in a liberal Methodist church I've had female pastors my entire life, and then becoming kind of in a liberal Baptist church. And sometimes intra-evangelical conversations I sometimes avoid because I feel like, well, that's not my community that I grew up a part of, and I don't have a lot of experience attending an evangelical church. But I think she obviously proves the thesis, and it's a very strong case about toxic masculinity and the ways in which we construct our faith communities. I think we see out in the world. And we have to think, some people want to divide sort of what happens in the church from what happens in society. And I think there is so much we can do within our own faith traditions to make them better live up to the what I believe to be the teachings of Jesus, that then impacts how people go and behave, like in politics, whether that's addressing, the role of women in leadership and getting more women in leadership and addressing toxic masculinity, or addressing LGBTQ issues in the church, addressing the sexual abuse that happens in churches. The biggest story that kind of shaped my faith was I think I was 12 when the clergy abuse scandal came out in the Catholic Church, and there's been others in other churches. So there's a lot in which we need to reform the church that then I think is a good starting place to reforming society and kind of having that moral voice. And then people only take the church seriously when the church has its own kind of business in order, to be able to then go out and have any kind of voice in the community.
Yeah. Quick question. Are you a fan of Kevin James Thornton, the TikTok 90s fundamentalist church guy?
I don't know him. I'm not very I'm not very into TikTok, I must admit.
Well, he's this like my wife. So like my wife was a PK. Like, she grew up in church. I did not grow up in church, and she's the one that got me onto it. And for listeners or viewers that know who he is, like they're all probably cheering right now. Like he's this gay guy who grew up in the church and like talks a lot about sort of like his experience like in that context growing up, and there's this one skit, I'm probably gonna butcher it, but like where he talks about he was in a prayer circle, and everybody was sort of praying, and it came to be his turn, and he hadn't come out yet, and like so as he was like about to pray, he says, I get the sense that someone in this group, has like same-sex desires or something like that. And he was talking about himself, but everybody in the group, didn't know that he was talking about himself. So it was like an interesting sort of like, I don't know, like juxtaposition to just like be in that scenario. Anyways, that's probably a really dumb story, but like you should check him out. And I probably spent way too much time talking about it. So anyways, that was my question. Go ahead, Josh. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. I was reading one of your articles that I think it was an NBC, but it was on the vaccine, like people coming out and saying like wearing masks, like mask mandates, that it's a obstruction of the image of God. And you're bringing some, I thought, very insightful criticisms against that. It got me thinking about, of course, the recent Supreme Court decision, where they've made two kind of conflicting decisions, and somewhat, it seems, regarding vaccine mandates. One in which they were okay, I guess what it was, a Biden v. I'm forgetting now. And then there's another one that was the National Association of Businesses versus like OSHA. Again, I probably didn't get that right, but it's the National Federation of Independent Business v. OSHA. And I was just curious, as we're working through this, what your views were of like the OSHA vaccine mandate, and even expanding more on that, like what are the limits you think from a Christian perspective, from a Christian left perspective, what are the limits that the government should have during a pandemic in terms of requiring people to be vaccinated, wear masks, especially people claiming to have religious exemptions or religious issues, not even specifically Christian, but religious issues or arguments against doing that?
Well, thanks for that question. I would say that my first response is that throughout the pandemic, the clear Christian call has been to do everything possible to save as many lives as possible. I wrote another piece for CNN right after the vaccines were announced, just in record time, that this was a huge miracle. Our prayers were answered. The vaccines have saved untold millions of lives, and it's amazing. And that the church should be doing, from like a Christian ethics perspective, everything it can to get people to take the vaccine. And there's actually been studies that show that religious leaders do have an impact in doing that. And then when it comes to religious exemptions, I find it very, very hard to believe there is a sincere religious objection to the vaccine. And I went and looked into all this research about different religious traditions. There was not a blanket objection to vaccines from a kind of organized group, that even Christian Science, kind of the most modern science, I think, of different organized religions, does not have a blanket, anti-vax statement. And the cases of what we saw people arguing for so-called religious exemptions were hard to take seriously. Like the guy in Oklahoma who's running for Senate, and it's like, I'll give a religious exemption to anybody from the COVID vaccine mandate. And so I think it is, if there are people that were, super against vaccines even before COVID and have this long demonstrated religious view that is anti-vaccine, then let's hear about that. I haven't seen, widespread evidence of that happening. I think vaccine mandates are called for, are a good public health measure. And I was really glad to see in May, I interviewed on our AmericanProgress.org website, I did an interview with the head of the Maine Council of Churches, and they actually got rid of their religious exemption for all different kinds of vaccines that are mandated. And so this is a good step, I think, and a lot of religious organizations called for that, because the mandates show, I was just listening to a podcast earlier about the mandate that United Airlines did on its employees, and how that really had a huge impact on them being able to operate. So I think the mandates are good, and I have not heard a good case for a religious exemption.
Real quick follow up. What did you like? How did you respond to the Supreme Court decision about the National Federation of Independent Business v. OSHA? Like what? I don't know if you were able to read the arguments, the dissenting and the pro arguments. Yeah, I'm trying to. But what were your responses to that as you looked at it?
Yeah, I haven't read the decision. I was generally disappointed, because I feel like that was a good way to get people to take the vaccine, and that there was not this widespread religious exemption vaccine. It's been manufactured as a political cause, I believe, during the pandemic, and that has had huge negative impacts on saving people's lives, and is really a sad development. Whereas all the churches that I follow, the vast majority, and Pew has research into this too, the vast majority of churches did what was right and stopped meeting in person, for instance, during the beginning of the pandemic. And then you had a few that were like, no, we're going to meet and fight the government. And that was, extremely frustrating to see churches take that stance.
Yeah. Now, excuse me. So you're a fellow at the Center of American Progress. And correct me if I'm wrong. Is there a division that's sort of separately labeled as religion and faith that you're a part of?
Yes, we have a team that handles religion and faith.
Got it. So what's kind of like the overarching mission like of that team? So because the Center for American Progress is, I don't even know how you would describe it. It's not like it's a think tank, probably. Is that probably the best way to describe it? So what is like the religion and faith portion center on?
So the Center for American Progress is a multi-issue think tank. We publish original research and different kinds of reports, issue briefs on a wide range of different issues on both foreign and domestic policy. If you want to read about all of our different issue areas, you can go to americanprogress.org. And then our team that deals with religion and faith has two major kind of buckets of work. The first is religious liberty policy. So we write, for instance, the column I was just referencing about this effort in Maine to provide leadership on religion and vaccines. Then we also, in that kind of bucket, do work around, we did a lot of work during the Trump administration around opposing Trump's Muslim ban, which was an infringement on religious liberty. We also do work to uphold things like to advocate for pieces of legislation like the Equality Act, which is, we think, a huge victory, would be, if passed, it's passed in the House, awaits action in the Senate, it would be a huge victory for religious liberty. So then we also work with religious leaders across all the different issues that CAP works on. And so that can be, people that were advocating for Build Back Better and the historic investments in childcare and pre-K and the climate investments. I did a column for CAP around all the different religious activism that happens for climate change. We put out a report recently about the religious activism around gun violence prevention. Wherever you look in the progressive movement, there's a lot of religious advocacy. So that's the second bucket, is kind of doing research and making people aware of and amplifying religious advocacy across a range of different issues.
Got it. So like with advocacy on certain issues, whether it's climate change or immigration reform or equality, what have you, I mean, like, is that advocacy done on, or done from kind of a Christian perspective, or is it sort of cross or does it cross multiple religious lines? Because I mean I'm not an expert in all the religions, but I'd assume that there's got to be some areas where some religions would conflict with like my own personal Christian view about X, Y, and Z or what have you.
So I think any religion, there's a diversity of belief within that religion, just like we've been talking about the differences in Christianity. I mean, every denomination is also diverse. So, there's a lot of Baptists that probably don't like a lot of the work I do and the views I take in my kind of advocacy work. And the Center for American Progress, though, is a secular think tank. We are not a religious organization, but we work with and in partnership with a wide variety of religious organizations. There's on our website, keep plugging the website, hope people go and visit. There's a list of some of our partners. So we have Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, Sikh, Jewish, the organized non-religious we also work with, because as much as we advance the cause of different religious groups and their advocacy, we also want to always reinforce the separation of church and state and make sure people hear about the organized non-religious, whether that's American atheists, people that organize themselves around being secular. And then one thing I'll also mention that is a good way to kind of learn more about our work is every year we put out a list of faith leaders to watch. And these are exciting faith leaders that we've been doing this list since 2012. So now there's many dozens of them. And it's a kind of who's who of activism from a progressive faith standpoint. And it's different religions, different issues, but all kinds of people that are advancing progressive change.
So in other words, Josh can't be on that list, right? Sorry, Josh. Womp womp.
There are many other lists. I'm sure you have on other guests that make other lists that Josh could be on.
There are great other options.
Yeah. So I'm curious. So with all the advocacy you do, I mean, like, is there a portion of that advocacy that tries to, for the lack of a better term, like to get the souls to the polls, like, you know, the movement down in Georgia does, because it's like there was a Pew Research poll back in like August of last year, you know, that was like 7 in 10 white non-Hispanic Americans, you know, who attended religious service regularly voted for Trump, like 70% of them, while only like a quarter, like 27% voted for Biden. And I'm curious on, you know, number one, like why that is, and you know, I've got thoughts of why that is, but it seems like there's sort of like this, you know, underground movement or existence of believers that may think more, you know, progressively, but aren't necessarily, you know, coming out and voting in droves. So what are you guys doing, I guess, about that?
And that poll was white
Mm-hmm.
religious people. Yeah, It's very interesting to me that, and this is, you know, not to push back against your question too much, but I see this kind of widespread when we talk about religion and politics, that we talk about white religious people as being motivated by their religion, and then Black Americans and people of color generally as motivated by their race as their involvement in politics, and erase the religiosity. We de-emphasize the religiosity of people of color in American, you know, politics, and then overemphasize it for white, you know, religious people, especially white evangelicals. So I would say let's look at let's first of all, let's think about everybody in the country and their religious motivations. And then also I'll just say the Center for American Progress is a 501c3 non-partisan nonprofit organization. So we're not involved in any kind of electoral campaigning or partisan campaigning. We do support voting rights as an issue area and support, you know, making it easier to vote from a policy standpoint. But what I always come back to when we're just talking about white evangelicals is the, you know, diversity within that community, and the 20 whatever percent you said of white evangelicals that voted for Biden, those stories, because those are the voices that we so often don't hear from. And then I think that the cause of it is simple. In terms of like why the religious right has been so successful and done so well electorally, is they made it so simple. It's like criminalize abortion and, you know, hate gay people. Those are the two issues. Those are the only things that are Christian issues, and, you know, rally people around that. It's very simple. Whereas it's in the progressive space, there's a lot of issues. One day you're talking about immigration, you're talking about voting rights, you're talking about climate, you're talking about war, and approaching all of those religiously, and it's very complicated and messy sometimes.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I guess it kind of makes me sad when I hear you talk, because I want there to be a robust conversation with, you know, evangelical whites, to not just focus on those two issues and actually be individuals, you know, that can't just be, you know, it can't just be bought, for lack of a better term. Our votes can't just be bought or manipulated into that. And in that vein, because I have a lot of different, I like to see myself as an individual. I like to see myself as not just having, I'm sure there are clusters of beliefs, right, that you can see around certain people that vote a certain way. You might see clusters of beliefs if you were to do a survey, that they might believe similarly within this group. My question is, say hypothetical, it's hypothetical. Say you were doing research and you came to a place where you're like, wow, like the research I'm doing is making me think like differently, or is coming to a different conclusion than would be, considered acceptable, or the reigning view within, say, the Center for American Politics, or on the other side, say something like the Heritage Foundation, or something like that. Say you're in, because you're kind of in this space of research. If you come to a place where your research is saying something different than kind of what your principles, might drive you to write or conclude. I don't know if that's ever happened to you, or if you know people that's happened to. Like, how might that work with I guess my question is, how much can these more partisan think tanks actually encourage free thinking? If there is a line that you can't cross in terms of policy thoughts, does that question make sense? I don't know if I need to rephrase it. I'm just wondering how that might work in your experience, whether it's you personally or things you've seen.
Sure, and I will just reiterate that the Center for American Progress is a nonpartisan think tank, and there is no list of principles or policy positions that are research. There's no point in the process at which I check what faith leaders are saying and doing, and check that against some, script or some. We're not the Democratic Party that has a platform or anything. There's the research is independent and comes out of what we're seeing faith leaders doing, and so I can say, in my I'm coming up. I started February 1st of 2020, so coming up on 2 years at CAP. There's never been some kind of, does this match some policy litmus test that someone has come up with. And I will say, I can just speak for myself. I'm a fellow. I have my own views, and a lot of what I also do is research what faith leaders are doing in this space. So those are two separate things. But I will say my own views have changed over time. So there's my own views, and I'll speak specifically about war. I grew up at a time when there was a lot of talk about genocide that was happening in Rwanda, and then in Darfur, and there was a strong sense of the humanitarian interventions were right and just, and I have someone that's studied just war theory and thought a lot about the use of military force when that is called for, when that can be accomplished, and the kind of ethics around that. And my views have changed. I've become much, much, much more reluctant to think the use of military forces ever accomplishes something good. So I've just seen that change in my own life. And then the people we uplift, for instance, I was talking about faith leaders to watch. We put one on there from the Friends Committee on National Legislation, the former head. That's a Quaker peace organization. They're very, about as nonviolent as you can get. There are other groups that, have that are not in that kind of pure pacifist kind of mindset. So there's a diversity, that war is just one issue that where my views have changed, and there's a diversity of beliefs. But yeah, I think it's important to show that diversity, and that there's never a set, position that we're all trying to. And look at, I mean, also in the Democratic Party, even, separate from our work at CAP, the Democratic Party has a platform, and yet the range of views between Bernie Sanders and Joe Manchin, I guess Bernie's not really a member of the party, the range of views between Elizabeth Warren and Joe Manchin are very different. So even in the political parties, there's a range of different beliefs. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I hope that answered your question, Josh.
My last question for you is so, gosh, I guess this is 2022. So in 2020, there's a lot of social justice protests, especially after the death of George Floyd. And I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts on, the Christian response to, the social justice movement. And this isn't necessarily just like, progressive Christian response. It's just broadly speaking, as a body of believers, like how did we do? Because, I will say, Josh was even out there in the streets, and he got beat up for, I think, saying Black Lives Matter once or something like that, and got beat up by his community. So I'm curious on how you feel, us Christians, how do we do?
Well, I would say a mixed bag, as always, on any issue. I will say there was a prophetic voice that proclaimed Black Lives Matter immediately. I remember when the Black Lives Matter kind of movement started after the George Zimmerman acquittal. I was living in DC at the time in the Trayvon Martin killing, and I was living in DC, but I was actually in New York visiting my sister, and we went to church the next day after the acquittal, and Reverend Jackie Lewis, the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, the senior minister of Middle Collegiate Church, had the whole church wear hoodies in solidarity with Trayvon Martin. And then when I was in seminary, when Black Lives Matter continued to build in 2014, the whole seminary was turned into a protest hub where the professors and the students were out in the streets protesting. And you saw that everywhere there was a Black Lives Matter kind of uprising. In Ferguson, there was a lot of religious activism there. There were Christians who immediately knew the Christian call was to proclaim Black Lives Matter, to work for racial justice, to stand up to police brutality, all of that. And then, of course, there were the silent Christians who said nothing out of fear. And then there was people that, have now kind of fomented this backlash, which is this whole made-up anti-critical race theory so-called movement that has been manufactured as backlash, and you see Christians supporting that. So you have a range of views. You have the leadership in many ways of the Black church, which is the kind of moral conscience of the church, and then you have a lot of white Christians not getting it. But I do, to your point about a lot of people who, consider themselves to be more conservative did get involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. I grew up in Houston, Texas, and I was very surprised to see Joel Osteen even, I think, showed up at one. So there was this kind of people getting pushed to really do something. And I hope that continues, that people do the hard work of getting involved and support Sheila Jackson Lee. Speaking of Houston, I had the most amazing congresswoman growing up, Sheila Jackson Lee, who is the lead sponsor of H.R. 40, which is the bill to study reparations. So now that the protests, so many people have gotten involved in the protests and everything, now's the hard part of, well, that was hard too, but it continues to be hard to actually enact policy change. And that's why supporting things like HR 40 is so important. And I hope more Christians will get involved in that work.
That's really cool. Yeah. Well, thank you so much,
Really
Guthrie.
cool.
I really appreciate you
Yes.
spending some time with us, and I don't know, just talking about your work and kind of your views and thoughts. And what's sort of like next on your agenda? I noticed that you and your husband have moved to the swamp, or are moving to the swamp.
We are planning. We are still in Louisville and are planning to move to DC. Which I'm excited about. I lived in D.C. Before, went to college in D.C. And yeah, people always are. I said the other day we did this thing at church where it's called Cloud of Witnesses, where we kind of share our faith story. And I was like, I work in politics and public policy, and a lot of people find that dysfunctional and kind of gross and not a good thing to work in. But my experience of DC in the religious space is that there's so many people who are there. Think about Nuns on the Bus. I don't know if you all have heard of them. That Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice. They are a group of nuns that go around advocating for the common good. There's so much good that happens from a religious common good standpoint in DC that it makes, you can just ignore all the corporate lobbyists and the special interests and stuff. And the kind of religious organizing space in DC is wonderful. So I'm excited to be a part of it again.
That's really cool. Awesome. Well, thanks again. And thank you to our listeners and viewers. And we will see you next week. So thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you.